and is to be is still the same.
As Courtney has already told us, the summer series is Flourish, the Story of God with Us. And a series of words were selected as ideas by which to focus on flourishing from different perspectives. The word assigned for us today is dwell. You can see we've done garden, peace, and freedom already. Next week, justice. Dwell has been used as the English translation for several Hebrew and Greek words, meaning inhabit or abide or remain or sit or settle down. It's more of a King James word. As Courtney was talking to the kids, it's not the kind of word we say anymore. We don't say that Doug dwells in Lemoore or I dwell in Fresno. But we do use it in the Bible. In the King James Version of John 1:38, it says, "Then Jesus turned and saw them following. And he said to them, 'What seek ye?' They said unto him, 'Rabbi, where dwellest thou?' In the Common English Bible, the phrase is translated, 'Rabbi, where are you staying?' Incidentally, Jesus responds saying, 'Come and see.' And I've always been disappointed that the author doesn't finish the story and show us where does Jesus actually dwell. And I think that could be a good sermon topic, but not for me. In the Hebrew Bible, dwell is mostly used in the same concrete way as in the John example, in the sense of where people live. But dwell is also sometimes used as a metaphor, such as in the 23rd Psalm, where the poet ends by saying, "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." In the New Testament, dwell is sometimes used in an abstract, mysterious sense. The Romans passage is one. 1 John 4:16, "And we have known and believed that the love that God hath to us, God is love, and he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God, and God in him." Another good sermon topic, and I suspect that's what Courtney thought today's sermon might be, but it isn't. As many of you know, I grew up on a chicken farm, or as my father preferred, a poultry ranch. We had about 20,000 laying hens, and it was a family operation. That's my dad hauling in eggs. That was probably 1 or 2 days worth of eggs from the farm. One of the things about a chicken farm is that the chickens do not take the summer off. They don't even take weekends off. Every day eat, every day lay eggs. So the farmer every day must feed the chickens, every day must gather eggs. This makes planning a vacation trip complicated. Going on a trip meant having to entice Uncle Herb and Aunt Laverne Rickert, or Ed and Esther Ratzlaff, to sacrifice part of their summer to take care of our chickens. Nevertheless, we did manage some short getaways while I was growing up. We took one long vacation trip, a glorious 3-week trip across the US in 1964. Glorious because I was 17, armed with a driver's license, and I got to drive part of the way. We saw the Great Salt Lake, the Mormon Tabernacle. We saw Niagara Falls straddling Canada and the US. I remember romantically wishing that I was there with Joan instead of my family. We went to New York City, where we attended the World's Fair, and we took a tour of the city. This included going to the top of the Empire State Building, where we ran into B.J. Braun, of all people. Braun was a well-known Mennonite Brethren pastor and seminary professor for a while. We then went to Washington, D.C., where my uncle was a doctor at the Walter Reed Hospital. There we explored the Smithsonian museums and the National Mall. Heading south, we toured a cigarette factory in Salem, North Carolina. My dad believed that smoking was one of the 4 cardinal sins, and why he took our family on a tour through a cigarette factory, I'll never know. We then drove through the still segregated South, where I saw firsthand whites only signs over water fountains and restrooms and restaurants. Getting closer to home, we toured Hoover Dam. Travel was a hassle, as I've said, because of our chickens, but there were other issues as well. My dad was never too enthused about travel. He complained that he never slept as well in a strange bed as in his home, as in his own bed. He also tended to have trouble staying regular during travel, if you know what I mean. And if you don't, I'm sorry. Joan didn't think it was appropriate if I used the C word in a sermon, so I'm not going to. Tolstoy once said, "All great literature is one of 2 stories. A man goes on a journey, or a stranger comes to town." And this makes sense. You could make a story about my trip across the country to visit the World's Fair and all those other places. But what kind of a story can you make out of feeding chickens, sleeping well, and staying regular? I think the authors of the Bible agreed with Tolstoy. Audrey suggested that the words in our summer series are chronological, so I began my preparation by looking in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, for sermon ideas. What I was looking for was stories of dwelling, but what I found are mostly stories of journeys. People on journeys, usually to or from Canaan, where God's people were supposed to dwell. These journey stories are mostly migrations, sometimes forced by climate change and famine, sometimes by social conflict of some sort. They were more like the migrations of people from Central America than my family's vacation trip to the World's Fair. They were probably not times of flourishing. Israel's story begins with Abraham's migration from Ur to Haran with his father Terah, and a second migration from Haran to Canaan with his nephew Lot. From Canaan, there was a succession of additional journeys due to famine. Abraham migrated to Egypt for a time. During another famine, he migrated to the Philistine city of Gerar. Abraham's son Isaac made a similar migration to Gerar a generation later, also due to famine. The story of Isaac's servant traveling to Haran to find a wife for Isaac is a more pleasant adventure. Then we read of Abraham's grandson Jacob fleeing from Canaan to Haran after deceptively stealing the family blessing from his brother Esau. 20 years later, Jacob returns in fear back to Canaan after embezzling livestock from his uncle Laban. Then Abraham's great-grandson Joseph is sold to slave traders by his brothers and taken to Egypt. Years later, due to famine in Canaan, the whole Israelite founding family migrated to Joseph's Egypt. Some 400 years pass without any explanation, except that during that time the Israelites have become slaves. That is the setting for the Exodus, a long, tortuous journey back to Canaan. And a few centuries later is the story of the exile to Babylon. And then 70 years later, a remnant returns to Jerusalem. Lots of journey stories that do not give us much information on dwelling or flourishing. There are a few stories, however, that give us a glimpse of dwelling. Two of them are stranger comes to town stories. One of these is when three strangers visit the geriatric Abraham and Sarah to predict that they are miraculously still fertile. Abraham and Sarah immediately show hospitality. Sarah gets out 5 gallons of fine flour. It says how much, and it's about 5 gallons, and whips up some baked goods, while Abraham goes out to his herd and chooses a calf to butcher. And then he gets some yogurt and milk, all of which they serve to the strangers. The second story is the well-known love story of the beautiful stranger come to town Ruth. In this story, the farmer, Boaz, purposefully leaves some of his barley in the field so that it could be gleaned by the pretty young immigrant. He is then careful to follow societal rules about relationships and kinship responsibilities before claiming Ruth as his wife. From these stories and a few others, we do have some idea of typical Israelite dwelling. We know that they were mostly agriculturalists who raised sheep and goats and cattle, and they farmed grain as well as olives, figs, and wine grapes. There's no mention of chickens, but they did sometimes eat the fatted fowl. Most likely, like my life on the chicken farm, there were daily and seasonal work routines punctuated by Sabbath observance and periodic celebrations with family and friends, and they were hospitable. Tolstoy would not think there is much of a story material in how the Israelites dwelt, except when strangers came to town. In terms of finding sermon material for dwelling to flourishing, I found hints in these stories that became clearer when I read through the Hebrew law book of Leviticus. The laws and admonitions of Leviticus are not rules of the road, as you might expect with all the travel stories, but rules for how the people should live when they dwell in their land. There are rules for how to make offerings to the Lord of their livestock and grain. There are rules against lying and cheating and steals, and rules about how to atone for your sins if you do such things. There are rules governing what foods are okay to eat and what to do about contagious skin diseases or other ailments. There's a very interesting admonition in Leviticus 19 not to harvest your crops all the way to the end of the row. Some grain and fruit should be left for the poor and immigrants to glean. And further along in chapter 19 is the admonition to treat immigrants as if they were citizens, and even to love them as yourselves. And finally, there is the admonition to observe Sabbath and other sacred times, and to even give the land a year off every 7 years as well. There's a significant difference between the way the Hebrews were taught to dwell and the way we Americans have been taught. The American way is to keep careful watch over your assets and don't let any slip away. Make sure you take care of yourself first and foremost. Get the highest possible return on your investments. Get the most production per acre from your land as you can. Sabbath observance is a fuzzy concept in America. The typical work week is 5 days, which can account for a Sabbath day. But our economy is based on business being open 7 days a week and farming the land every year. The American response to immigrants tends to be different as well. I don't think we citizens love immigrants as ourselves, even though all of us come from immigrant stock. God's way seems to be more concerned about the whole community having enough to eat, and also about the long-term fertility and health of the land. And God's idea of community is more inclusive, even of immigrants. This pattern, stories of travel but rules for dwelling, found in the Hebrew Bible, is also found in the Greek Testament. Jesus' whole ministry took place in the context of traveling between the Galilee and Jerusalem. Paul was constantly on the road or on the sea between Jerusalem and Rome. But the teachings of Jesus and Paul were mostly about how to dwell in community. Jesus famously summarized all the rules in the Bible as love your neighbor, love God and love your neighbor. So how do we see flourishing in the presence of God as viewed from the perspective of the word dwell? Flourishing is promised in the Leviticus 26 passage that Steve read. There's a similar but shorter statement in Leviticus 25 that you can see here. Observe my rules and keep my regulations and do them so that you can live securely on the land. The land will give its fruit so that you can eat your fill and live securely on it. This isn't really flashy flourishing. It doesn't lend itself to a memorable story like my family's trip to New York, or like the Exodus in Israelite history. It celebrates enough. Its aim is not the most bushels per acre or the biggest savings account, but rather everybody having enough. It is a day after day sort of routine of work or responsibility within an inclusive community, punctuated by regular Sabbath observance and periodic community celebrations. Dwelling by the precepts that Jesus summarized as loving God and loving neighbor promotes the kind of flourishing that is characterized by food security and safety for the whole community, family, fellow citizens, and even immigrants. It is the kind of flourishing that allows you to sleep well at night because you're well fed and you're in good standing with your neighbors and with God. May we all so flourish.